Hello, YouTube. This is a response to DevShell2, who put up a video called "The Failure of Occupy," um, and I'm a little confused about it. Right? Um, he basically claims that the Occupy movement was a failure, and I'm not sure. At the end of the video, he starts going on about well, maybe it could have presented an alternative, like, political player who could have been, in the elections or something like that, right? So apparently, the conception of the success of Occupy would have been for it to be subsumed into the Democratic Party, um, uh, much like the Tea Party was, right? So the Tea Party is all about trying to uh, create within the system an articulation of a new politics within the framework of American politics. This to me wasn't at all the point of Occupy Wall Street, and he says, I was there, and you know what? Like, I was too. Um, I am from New York, and I spent a bit of time in Zuccotti Park, and I I'm baffled by it because what he thinks the goals of Occupy were don't seem to me to be the goals of Occupy. He says, if only they could have gotten together and picked representatives, and picked some kind of the best and the brightest among them to all get together and do something. I don't know. He basically claims that the model of representative democracy is superior to the model of he seems to just take it a priori, that direct democracy is going to fail, and he talks about a bit about consensus formation, and I just wanted to talk about that. The Occupy movement, in part at least, depending on who you were talking to down there, because obviously ideologically it was very fractured, and it should have been. That's not a bad thing. In part, the idea was to present not an alternative to Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. It wasn't to present an alternative within that framework. No, it was an attempt to begin experimenting with an alternative to representative democracy. This is why they held fast to the direct democracy process, consensus building, and things like that. Now, he says, it was 100% consensus, and then they dropped it to 80% consensus, and then they clung on to this, and then it fractured the whole thing. But I don't think he understands the fact that what's being done here is what's being done is experimenting. They're working out different ways, of conceiving of political organization apart from the traditional methods, because the theory is that different forms of organization will produce have the potential to produce different results, right? And if you look at the central intellectual figures who were a part of it, you can see this in their writings. Thinking specifically of people like David Graeber. Zizek has written extensively about it. Simon Critchley has written extensively about it. A number of intellectuals were sort of fascinated by what was going on, and the reason why was that Occupy was not a single issue protest, right? This is where I think he gets confused about the definition of success or failure. Occupy was not an attempt to deal with a particular problem. It wasn't like the protest against the war in Iraq, right? Which was a single issue. It wasn't like civil rights protests, which is a small body of issues. It was a protest against the system as such. And if you want to talk about what they accomplished, that's something that's a much more fascinating conversation. It doesn't seem to me that the success of Occupy stands or falls on whether or not they're represented in the November elections. In fact, if they were represented in the November elections, it would have been a failure of Occupy. Um, it seems to me that the great success of Occupy was the fact that it opened up a space and legitimized a certain number of propositions, right? So all of a sudden people are talking about the politics of debt, right? And it becomes a real political issue, and the idea is that, like, we could theoretically do something about it, right? Just that ideological shift from this is a fact of life to this is a contingent thing that we can do something about. Just that is enough for me to say that Occupy is a success. Just the fact that the rhetoric changed, introduced slogans like the 99% and the 1%, and reconceived of the American political system and changed the discourse around it, if only marginally. That in and of itself is a success of Occupy. Another one that obviously wouldn't have been put out. And you talk, the gentleman who made the video talks about, we all watched the police become militarized. We all watched all of these things, and then it fade away. But the fact is, the challenge that was presented there doesn't go away, right? First of all, the movement goes on, but second of all, the fact that we as a generation have all been exposed to that side of government activity is in itself a success, and these are sufficient, to justify the existence of Occupy, and they're remarkable successes. And the ability that it was able to get as much coverage as it was remarkable as well. I mean, you don't see this around the G20 protests and stuff like that. You don't see this extent of coverage, and you don't see as sympathetic of coverage. You know what I mean? You see, typically it seems like the news media just waits for a riot to happen and then film that. Now, the other thing that I wanted to touch on was that behind the scenes a lot happened, right? So, like, behind the scenes, Occupy was really interesting because it opened up a space where like labor organizations, political activists, academics, and all of these different groups together could interact and talk, right? And all of these people, all of a sudden, people realized, like, wow, these are all real issues, and organizations started to interlink with one another, and that's a lasting effect, right? The relationships that were formed as a result of Occupy between labor movements and such, and political movements, what were at one point marginal political movements that have kind of come closer to recognition, right? Those bonds are there, and those bonds are great, right? So the fact is, what Occupy was not an attempt to go through the system, right? It was an attempt to articulate a system, a new system. It was an attempt to articulate a new system while at the same time unveiling or sort of revealing the issues with the old system, the current system, right? And on both of those counts, I think they were pretty successful. Some versions of Occupy more than others on the articulating a new system front. But I think it's actually a tremendously inspiring thing that they were able to do as much as they were. Like, yeah, political coverage of them died off. Like, the media coverage of them died off, and this is what you're lamenting. Again, like, those kids are still in Zuccotti Park. I mean, they're not in Zuccotti Park, but the organization goes on, right? And we see this Occupy Sandy was tremendously inspirational. These activities still persist. and they can interlock with other activist organizations and such like this. So the idea, it seems like your argument is basically that the news media coverage died down and therefore the whole thing was a failure. And no, if we had some talking head on a podium bidding for your election in November, that would have been the failure. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. I'm a bit baffled by your video. It seems that you got on board with Occupy and totally missed the point of Occupy. And I don't know, maybe I'm off base there. But having spent time with the activists, having grown up with a lot of the activists, having read the literature to have come out of it, as somebody who knows about this, it seems to me that you missed everything that happened. You wanted Occupy to be the Tea Party. And yeah, have a good day.